Good morning. Glad you're all here. I am so excited to have Suzanne Pharr here with us today. Ever since I heard Suzanne speak at the Eagles Conference this year, I knew we had to have her back. My belief is that we can help educate and stop the picture of hate that is now showing through events such as this one. As you can see, we will be filming Suzanne's presentation. The camera will not be on anyone in the audience, so during the question and answer period, if you have questions, please speak up so that the camera can pick up your comments. But before we start, I want to give you something that I use to remind me that we need education in order to learn to stop hurting each other. You see, I use the movies to remind me that what is acceptable misbehavior today can be viewed differently. Movies have taught us that sometimes the truth we knew and accepted was not really the truth. That in hindsight, abuse and inhumane treatment that people intentionally or habitually force on each other was wrong. For example, the film Not Without My Daughter is a movie which depicts a woman without any rights. Yes, we were appalled, but I can tell you less than 10 years ago in this country, my grandmother was a woman without rights. What will we think of today's women's rights in 10 years when we look back? Fried Green Tomatoes, a sweet movie where again we were repulsed by wife beaters and Afro-American haters. Yet the movie was a vivid reflection of the times and its acceptable behavior. The Long Walk Home and Stand Up and Deliver identified behavior that we know today to be ungodly, unchristian, and wrong. Yet it was quite acceptable at the time. How many movies of the crucifixion have been made when the priests, godly stewards, used the word to hold on to their personal power? You ask yourself, how could people take it? How could people do it? How could people let it happen? I want to remind each of us today that someday someone is going to make a movie about this time, and the movie could be called The Amendment. And my point, how do you think your role will be seen in history? Now let me officially introduce Suzanne Pharr to you. Out of pure modesty, Suzanne has asked me to be brief with her introduction. So let me tell you this. Suzanne chooses to be introduced as an author of the book, Homophobia, a Weapon of Sexism. As a longtime civil rights worker from the South. As a founder and staff member at the Women's Project in Arkansas since 1981. That she works across issues in sexism, racism, and homophobia, showing how they are connected, trying to bring together the groups that are targeted by these oppressions and helping them to work in solidarity. A special note, Suzanne's book is here. We have a limited number of copies. And Denise Beam, Denise, can you wait? Denise will be selling them if you choose to buy one. Now I want to remind you that all the proceeds go to funding the organized work at the Women's Project. So feel free about getting one. Now I'd like to present to you a friend and a teacher, Suzanne Pharr.
No hand. So, good morning. I want to say thanks to Mike for having me here. It's his persistence, which is, as the kids all say these days, awesome, and his commitment to social change that made this happen. As his desire to have a videotape, his desire to have a message that we could use to talk with each other about what's happening in this country and what we're sort of up against, what kinds of dangers are out there. And so Mike, having, I think, tremendous insight about that, made this happen. So I'm going to talk today about the religious right and about deep concerns that I have and that many of us have, and I think you can't be in Colorado and not know about the religious right. You can't be in this country and not know about the religious right. But you have a pretty striking example of them here with your amendment to the Constitution that is on the ballot this fall, and I want to talk a little bit more about it later. But what I want to do first is to try to put this in some kind of perspective and sort of lay out what I think their agenda is and why we should be concerned about it. Now, to give you just a little bit of understanding about how I come to this, I work with an organization in Arkansas called the Women's Project. And at the Women's Project, we do a number of things, but one of the things we do is that we monitor hate groups, you know, people who do biased crimes, biased violence. And the 4 categories of violence that we monitor are racist violence, religious violence, sexist violence, and anti-gay and lesbian violence. And when we set this project up, we thought, well, somebody in the state just needs to be watching these people. You know, if we don't do anything else, if we can simply witness for history, sort of what Mike was talking about with the movies, so that in 10 years from now or 15 years from now at least, there would be some people of conscience who would say, we were there and we saw it and we said no to it, and that we would try to organize against them. But when we decided to do that, what we came to understand very fast was there's more to this than the far right, the neo-Nazis. There's more to it than the Klan. There's more to it than the Aryan Nation, the skinheads, the Christian identity churches. But that was sort of defined the far edge of the right. We also realized there were individual acts of hate violence, that what happened to people in their lives every day in terms of racism, what happened to their lives every day in terms of sexism or homophobia or anti-Semitism, that those acts, when you have hundreds of women being killed each year, hundreds of women being raped, when you have people of color being attacked at every turn, whether it's on the job or whether it's at home or whether it's on the streets, these were the things that people felt the most. So we began to look at that and keep track of those. When we began keeping track of those, we said, there's a climate out here that creates that. And it's not just the KKK. It's not just the Aryan Nation. It's not just the racist skinheads. We had to look at the fact that it's a whole other group, which is what we would call the new right in terms of the people like the people who are currently in office, I believe, in this country. And it's also the Christian right or the religious right, that they are actually creating a climate that sets us up for violence. And that for me was hard. It was hard to look at that because those are the people I come from. Those are the people I live with in Arkansas. Those are the people I've lived with all my life in the South. They're not somebody out there, you know, over yonder, as we would say in Arkansas. There's somebody here at home, and they're here at home in my people. And so that was hard. It was also hard to look at the scope of it, to look at the scope of how large this is, and to recognize that in this country right now in 1992, and we've been in this for about 20 years now, that we're in a battleground. We're in a battleground that is about, I believe, determining what the political and social and economic principles are that are going to shape our lives and freedom in this country. Now, I don't want to sound as though I'm exaggerating. You know, I want to make this very, very clear that this is indeed what it is, because, you know, you've got so many people who stand up, and I think particularly through the media, that say, this is Armageddon, you know, this is the end of the world right here. I don't think this is the end of the world, but I think it is significant change, and I do think it is a battle. And that battle is taking place in the Supreme Court. It's taking place in the assignment of federal judges to federal courts. It's taking place in the legislatures. It's taking place in the school boards. It's taking place in every institution in this country. And I think it's going to be an issue of, in the end, do we have real democracy here or do we not? That's the battle. And that's a very serious battle for me. It's a battle that involves every aspect of my life. It involves every aspect of my belief. So that is hard to look at it and to look at the scope being that big. I believe what you'll see when you look at this battle, that you'll see that it's a battle between the forces of repression and the forces of liberation. You'll see that it's a battle between the politics of exclusion and the politics of inclusion. And you'll see that it's a battle between authoritarian ideology or liberation ideology. Those are the things that are clashing in this country right now. And I think a lot of us have a fear about who will win. And many of us don't want to see it be a win-lose situation. We want to see it an issue of transformation. But that indeed is also what the right wants to see. Not a shootout, but a transformation. That's the reason the religious right is not revolutionary. It doesn't try to do an overthrow of the government. It doesn't try to do an overthrow of your local state legislature. It infiltrates institutions. It's reformist. Its goal is to get in all of the institutions and change them. Now, I think for the longest time, we didn't take that very seriously. We said, how can they be serious? Look who their leaders are. Jerry Falwell, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, Jimmy Swaggart. Remember Jimmy Swaggart? A lot of people don't remember him anymore. I'll never forget when he cried on TV and said, I have sinned. I said, well, Jimmy, just sex? I don't think so. You know? Let's think about the big sins here, not just whatever that was you did. But I guess the sin was he lied about it, that he went out and said to people, I am a person of purity. I'm a person who wouldn't have sex, maybe not even with my wife, and here it's been with a prostitute. Well, prostituted women have to do a lot of things to survive, and that was one of them. I shouldn't make fun of Jimmy, should I? I forgot I was on video there for a minute. But that was the sin. The sin was saying there is one standard of morality in this country, and that standard is a rigid standard, and everybody will have to yield to this standard, and that becomes a part of all that they do. And Jimmy Swaggart himself fell victim to that rigid standard of how people can live and how people can relate to each other and how people can communicate with each other. I think we also didn't take them seriously because they were Southerners. There's a great anti-Southern sentiment in this country, which is pretty interesting since we have a Southerner running for president right now. We'll see how that plays out. And also, probably even a bigger reason, is because they were working class, that we saw the religious right as being these white, Southern, working class people. And how could working class people ever lead any kind of movement? You know, there's just something so fundamentally wrong about that point of view, but I think we discredited them because of that. But who are they? And I think this is a place where we have to be very, very careful about who they are. And the reason we have to be careful is that people get hurt in this. People get pushed into categories that limit them and hurt them. The religious right is not all Christian conservatives. And that's, I think, where we got very, very confused, that we began to do what people would call Christian bashing in this and say, oh, so everyone who's a fundamentalist is a part of the religious right. Everyone who's an evangelical is part of the religious right. Everyone who's a born-again Christian is a part of the religious right. That is simply not true. They figure there are about 50 million Christian fundamentalists and evangelicals and born-again Christians in this country. Some of those are churched, and some of those are what we call unchurched, who have watched the electronic ministry, you know, and have come to that belief through watching late-night TV or watching the Christian Broadcasting Network. And out of those, 15 to 20 million are part of the Christian right. Now, when I say Christian right, I'm talking about people who are organized as groups who have an agenda, this agenda of change, which I will talk with you about. The rest of those people, the other 30 million or so, are simply exercising their freedom to believe and to practice religion in the way of their choice. It has nothing to do with the politics of an agenda, particularly a legislative agenda of change. Some of those people are progressive, and some of those are conservative, and they range between that. And to categorize them as one or the other is wrong. So we have to be very careful about that. But it is a large group of people. 15 to 20 million people is a lot of people. And it's a growing group of people, I believe, who make up the religious right. So that's who they are. And what they hold in common is a particular belief, which is a fundamentalist view of the Bible and of life. And the way that view reads, and this is like at the core of what they do, and so you have to sort of get this down, which is to read the Bible in a literal manner, which is to say that the Adam and Eve story is the way it went down. It went down in 6 days, and then there was a day of rest, and then, Eve did wrong. And we get back to sex all the time in this. I want you to pay attention to this theme that runs through. It's not this speech, but sometime we'll have to do a talk about sex, I think, in relation to this. So their view is that there is a God who is an anthropomorphic God. This is a man who has given power and dominion. This God, in their view, is a white man who has given power and dominion to man, who is also a white man, to have domination over the earth and all of its peoples. That means over women, that means over children, that means over people of color, and that means over what we would call nature, the environment. That hierarchy, in their view, in order for there to be social order and not be chaos, you have to have that hierarchy. So in order to install that, to make sure that we have it, there has to be a merger of church and state in this country, because you have to enforce that through institutions and through schools. Otherwise, we're out there believing whatever we want to believe. So if you're going to make people believe in this hierarchy and maintain this hierarchy, you've got to get in those institutions. You've got to make sure the Supreme Court is a certain way. You've got to make sure the legislature is a certain way. You've got to make sure the Department of Health and Human Services is made up in a certain way and gives a certain philosophy, and already it does. You've got to make sure the school boards do. And so that's what's going on, is that move to the creation of a church and state being one, so that a particular view of morality is legislated and it's enforced by law and it's enforced by the criminal justice system. That's what we're looking at in terms of the big picture. Now you may say, whoa, that sounds like a lot. I want to try to give you enough evidence that you'll begin to understand that that is indeed true. To make that happen, as I said, they have to be in every institution. I would submit to you that the religious right and the new right in this country have controlled the public agenda, the public debate in this country for the last 20 years. That for the most part, we have been reacting, those of us who are on the side of liberation, to put this in terms of side, against issues that have been named by the right. And I will name you some of those issues. If you don't believe that, I would ask you to look at the Roe v. Wade decision. That is 20 years old at this point. We have watched a systematic attack against that decision by the religious right for 20 years. That has not been just Operation Rescue. Operation Rescue only came on the scene, I believe, in 1987. And it appeared in the 1988 convention. The Republican convention was the first time that we saw their force. It has been in the legislatures, it has been through individuals, it has been in the courts, it has been in every place that you could see as a systematic attack against that decision. And people have felt pretty strongly that decision was going to go down this year. You're going to see it fought out next week at the Republican convention. You're seeing it right now, fought within the platform-making committee of the Republican convention. If you would take a look at affirmative action, it has been systematically attacked for the last 20 years. And we have watched that. You work for a corporation where you got to watch it. You got to watch it come in. I don't know how many of you have been there for 20 or 25 years, but if you have, you saw it come in and you've seen it chipped away at. Chipped away at that. So we have seen them maintain this public agenda. You saw them in the fight against the Equal Rights Amendment. There was a strong effort in this country to produce an amendment that would give equal rights to women, which is the way we usually do constitutional amendments in this country, which is to extend rights, not to take them away, but to extend rights. And Phyllis Schlafly, with the Eagle Forum, organized an attack against that was based on two very interesting pieces of information for the defeat, I think. One was that if we pass it, that women will be drafted. And the second was that men and women would have to use the same restrooms. And you know what? People bought that argument. But they were so well organized, going all over this country. I was in Little Rock, Arkansas, when they came in busloads from Virginia and North Carolina to make sure that our meetings about women would not go to the Houston conference carrying anything on it that was progressive. So we've watched this very, very carefully. We saw when Reagan went into office that the Christian Coalition formed in 1980 and put him in office. And that Christian Coalition is now in place and very, very strong and is working in this election that we see now. So that they are there. They're working very, very hard. The other thing I would ask you to think about is the level of organization. The level of organization is very, very high. And so it's not just a few people working in isolation, this church here or that individual there or that church there. But there are institutions that actually back this work. And I will just give you a few of the major players. The first one I'd like for you to think about is the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank out of Washington, D.C. And what their job is to make sure that the agenda of the right is carried forward. And so in preparation for a presidential election, they produce a book that talks about exactly the kinds of issues they want to see covered and how they should be put into place. They watch everything that the Congress does. And when the Congress does anything that's out of line, they're there to attack that. And we've seen that in case after case after case. They produce the ideas for how these struggles are to happen on the community level. They, for example, produce this no special rights idea that is now all over the country in terms of people of color, in terms of lesbians and gay men. It's a prestigious think tank. It's powerfully funded. And who is it funded by? One of your local boys, Coors. Now I was in a bar here last night where they offered me a Coors beer. And I try not to be nasty and political most of the time. I try to be political most of the time, try not to be nasty. And I just felt myself overcome and had to snap at him a little bit about not to ever offer, in fact, to take it out of his bar if he could. You know, you shouldn't even kiss someone who drinks Coors beer. That's how strongly I feel about it. Because their record is not good. It is not good on people of color. It is not good on women. And it's not good on lesbians and gay men. But that's one thing. That's the corporation. But in funding these rightist organizations that act against our best behalf, that's where I get scared. And the Heritage Foundation is funded by them. The second group that I would ask you to think about is the Rutherford Institute. And that has chapters throughout the country. That's the legal arm of the Christian right, and they produce the legislative and legal strategies. Another one is the Christian Broadcasting Network, and I think this may be the centerpiece of all that they do. And the reason it's so powerful, does everyone know the Christian Broadcasting Network? If you don't have cable, you might not know it, but it'd be hard not to know it. It's the most watched television worldwide, and it's both radio stations and television. And that's it's Pat Robertson's. He owns and is in charge of that. And you know the 700 Club that Pat Robertson has. There are a number of those kinds of programs on the Christian Broadcasting Network. The reason it's so important, it can do a couple of things. One, it can get the message out just like that. Whatever the message is that they want out, it can be put out to hundreds of thousands of people, be put out to millions of people instantly. And they can get the money back to fund whatever the strategies are to go with that message. But people sending in those $5 checks, those $10 checks, those $20 checks, they bring in worlds of money to be able to do the funding. Another group that you know is Operation Rescue. They call themselves the Foot Soldiers for making this kind of social change. And then two other groups that are very much foot soldiers and always bring a little sadness to my heart. One is Concerned Women for America, and the other one is the Eagle Forum that I mentioned before. Concerned Women for America is the largest conservative women's organization in the country, and it has 585,000 members, and it has a $5.4 million budget. The reason they are important is that those are the people who do what they call kitchen table activism, which is they go into homes and train 8 or 10 people at a time, women who are, many of them women who are not in the workforce, but women who are doing that enormous work that women do at home. And they train them so that when any issue comes up, and this is a good tactic. I'm not condemning this tactic by any means. I wish that we all did this tactic. They train them to put those letters on the legislators' table. You know, they train them to make those phone calls, to make sure that that legislation goes in their favor, to make sure that the school board acts in their favor. And they do, as you know, If you've ever watched the legislature here, you know how fast that can go and how just immediate it is. They have phone trees where they can just do it like that, and it's great. It's a wonderful thing. For us, it's a horrible thing, but for them, I mean, I envy that organizing. I think everybody has the right to do the kind of organizing that I'm talking about here. So those are the players. In terms of strategies, in order to get this kind of hierarchical point of view and this kind of morality in place and institutionalized, the way they have set about to do it in the infiltration of institutions and to get that change to happen is that they have chosen to dismantle the gains of the civil rights movement. This is the major attack that they are taking. And the reason for that is, if you put on one side that hierarchy and order goes from man having dominion over women, children, people of color, the earth, and all its peoples, then anyone who calls for liberation, anyone who steps outside of that order of authority and control becomes, in their view, a cause of chaos. They are the representative then of the breakdown of order. So what we saw in this country then is that the religious right actually formed out of and in response to the civil rights movement. Started forming in the campaign of, I've just forgotten his name, in Alabama, George Wallace. When George Wallace was running for office, that was when we began to see the first formation of the religious right. And what was it formed around? The issue of race. Now we think about it in terms of issues of abortion and homosexuality. But when we saw it first beginning, it was around issues of race. And issues of race have become incorporated in a different kind of way now. So the civil rights movement was a major, major threat to this notion of hierarchy and authority. Why was it? Because here you had, for the first time in US history, a large group of people who unified and said, we do not live in a true democracy. This is a democracy that does not work for us. That if you're going to have democracy, you have to have justice. If you're going to have democracy, you have to have participation and you have to have liberation. Otherwise, how are you participating? How do you get to be there if you don't have justice? You don't have participation. And they said, look at us. We are legally segregated. We are legally kept out of participation in everything in this country. So discrimination based on race keeps us from being able to participate in democracy. And believe me, those were heady, liberating words coming out of the 50s, out of that Supreme Court decision, out of Ms. Daisy Bates going to Central High School and integrating that school in the face of all of those cops and all of those National Guardsmen, in the face of all of those screaming and yelling white people. Those were heady words coming out of those sit-ins that occurred in those little drugstores across the South. Heady, liberating words. What happened then was African Americans did that. But when those laws began to be passed, of course, they extended to all people of color in terms of race. And so there was this lifting up of a people to say, we now have a vision of participating in democracy. And then those words were heard by other people. And the civil rights movement then gave birth to the women's movement, because women also heard that if you can't participate in democracy, if discrimination based on race keeps you from participating, then discrimination based on sex keeps you from discriminating. And people went, yes. And so by 1968, we were in the beginning of a women's movement. So what next? Of course, we had Stonewall, the Stonewall riots. I would like to call that the Stonewall uprising in New York for lesbians and gay men, where police had been brutally, brutally attacking gay bars, and particularly attacking men and women, lesbians and gay men of color, who were transvestites, who were drag queens, who were butches. They were attacking white people and people of color, but particularly people who were poor, who were in those bars. And then they went too far. They crossed the line. And when they crossed that line, suddenly, and I honor those people today because they gave us a liberation movement, those people said, no, 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 no. You won't do this again. We'd rather die. We'll die right here if necessary. We will fight you right here. Stonewall, the name of a bar, became a line that was drawn to say, liberation is on this side of this line, and that's where I'm going to live. So people then looked around and said, well, if discrimination based on race and discrimination based on sex can keep you from participating in democracy, then so can discrimination based on your sexual identity. And we had a gay and lesbian movement that came out of that. And so for the religious right, these became then the people who challenged authority. The authority that created discrimination became for them the people who caused chaos. Rather than, as we read it, that what has caused social and economic chaos in this country is what Langston Hughes would call the dream deferred. What has caused social and economic chaos is greed, is discrimination, is the refusal to let people participate, refusal to let people be whole, to hold back liberation, to block it in subtle ways, in covert ways, and in overt ways at every turn. That is what has led to chaos in this country. Not that people demanded liberation, but because people did not get it. That has been the problem, as we would read that. So they have systematically attacked the civil rights movement and its gains. And they've been successful in those things that I named earlier, in that attack against Roe v. Wade, the attack against affirmative action, attack against all of those things. And what I'd like to talk about for a second is the strategies they use. Now, I mentioned the No Special Rights campaign. This has been a campaign that's gone along for quite a while now. I began hearing it for the first time, I believe, in the Anita Bryant campaign. Do you all recall that in Florida when Anita started not just singing for orange juice, but speaking out against lesbians and gay men? She should have stuck with good health, I think, but she had to do it. And she was avidly, she was sort of thrown into history, I think, but she spoke so vehemently against civil rights for lesbians and gay men and carried on a crusade there. And that was the first time that I heard no special rights. That for people to have protections under law, and for people to have anti-violence laws and anti-discrimination laws, and for people to have access, that this was a special right. This was to be asking for something that was above and beyond what regular people got. Now, name for me, regular people, but that would be if you weren't a person of color, if you weren't a woman, and you weren't lesbian or gay in terms of their vision. This has been one of the most compelling arguments that they have used, because particularly in a time of economic chaos, which we're in now, where all of us feel stress, you know, all this worry about what's going to happen. We worry about feeding kids. We worry about whether we're going to have a job next month. We worry about whether our company is going to be here or not. We worry, you know, it's a very, very big thing, no matter what level one is on in this country, I believe, that we're scared about this. And what they do is they move into that, and they start speaking particularly to working class people and say, the reason you have this economic chaos is that people are taking your jobs. You know, the reasons you have this is because this thing is going on out here that is about people asking for special rights. And look at you. Aren't you suffering? Aren't you hurting? Can you go to, you know, to a grocery store and buy groceries the way you could 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Or don't you have crime in your neighborhood now? Don't you have drugs in your neighborhood now? So there's all of that talk. And the very people, they say, who are causing that are taking your rights away. And they're taking them away because they're taking your job through affirmative action. They're taking your money through welfare. They're taking your money through crime because we're having to spend so much on jails to warehouse them. We're having to spend so much on cops. And people resonate to that. People say, well, yeah, I got crime. Yeah, I got drugs in my neighborhood. Yeah, I don't have enough money. And I think this needs to stop. This campaign is based on this notion. And this is the argument they give, that the original framing of the Constitution by the Founding Fathers gave us all the rights we needed. Now, I would ask you to remember who was there for the framing. who they represented and who it was framed for. You don't get taught that in school too much, but I would ask you to recall that. And that was as much as we needed, that we all already have rights from that original framing. Therefore, to ask for anything that offers access or protection, that's to ask for a special right. And so it should be then denied. So that you can have on the ballot here in Colorado an amendment to rescind anti-discrimination laws and prevent people from putting them on any, to pass them at any point in the future. That's the amendment that you're now looking at here. With people saying to you every day here in the press that for lesbians and gay men to have these laws is a special right. When there is no law there to protect us. They say we're already under all of the laws. I don't think so. I don't believe so. The same thing that they say about people of color. Why do we need hate violence laws? Why do we have to look at bias crime? Why should we just have that even as a category? Isn't everybody already covered? I don't think so. But that's the argument. And so I believe ultimately this goal is not just to dismantle the gains of the civil rights movement that began to try to give a little bit of justice. And let me tell you, that justice has not been rolling down like a river. To give a little bit of participation and a little bit of liberation. I think the ultimate goal was to go for the Bill of Rights, because I think those also to the right. And we began to hear Pat Buchanan talk about this, and we began to hear David Duke talk about this, that the Bill of Rights are also seen, those rights are seen as special rights. That if we could just have that original framing of the Constitution, maybe we could get back this hierarchical authority. So that's one of the things, and you'll hear that the most often. The other two things you'll hear is you hear them talking and entering communities all over the country around the issues of abortion and the issues of homosexuality. And the reason for that is the belief that these are two highly charged emotional issues that many people feel conflicted about, many people feel ignorant about. More conflicted on abortion and more ignorant, I think, on homosexuality, but emotionally charged around both of those because they bring them in as morality issues. And that you can get people to coalesce around those, get people to understand those, get people to say, oh, this threatens my life, this threatens my community in some way. And then they can build a constituency, so then they can attack everything. So what you see is them building constituency, for example, here in Colorado around homosexuality. But what you'll see in the legislature this year will not be just laws and concerns about homosexuality. There will be laws that concern parental leave. They'll be attacking laws that are about affirmative action. They'll be attacking all of those things that have to do with people of color, that have to do with women. You'll see that across the board, using that same constituency they have built under this. And it will work, unless it is confronted in some way by people who care and believe in another kind of way. So now with those two issues, I think the technique that they use, which is a very, very clever technique, is two things. One is the attaching of morality to behavior and attaching that behavior to a certain group of people so that we become increasingly prejudiced against that group of people. And the other is misinformation and disinformation. Let me just tell you a little bit about the attaching of morality to behavior. They do a lot of this under the traditional family values. You know, who is tearing down the family, who is destroying the family. But they do it in other ways. And I would refer you to the David Duke campaign, where you got to see a combination of the religious right and the far right, a neo-Nazi revolutionary talking on the one hand, and a religious right reformist going through the legislative process talking on the other hand. And what he did is he followed in the path of Reagan and Bush. And we had seen this before, but we got to see it so vividly through the Bush campaign in the last election, of this attaching of morality to behavior. In the Willie Horton ad, do all of you all recall that? It's an ad that I thought was just clever as sin. I just thought it was too clever. And that what they accomplished with that was that they were able to say visually to us, dozens and dozens of times a day, this man is a convicted rapist and killer. He is black. He has been let out of prison by the governor of Massachusetts who is running for president. And over and over and over in your mind, you got this coded language: rapist, killer, African American, liberal. So you got two messages from this ad. Who is it that rapes and kills? African Americans. Who is it that's soft on them? Democrats or liberals. And so this message began to be fed to the American people that if you elect a Democrat, what you will get are rapists and killers who will be African. They will be soft on crime, soft on African Americans. But what happened in that is that it became this behavior of raping and killing became attached to a whole race of people, that this is who does the raping and killing. So what did you see with David Duke? You saw an increase in that kind of coded language. So what David Duke set up is that people on welfare are African American or they are Latino. That was where he began to put that out. And what happens with welfare, he says, it is ruining our economy. This is the thing that is making us be in economic chaos. The second thing he put out was who does crime? And he made that African American and people of color in general, but particularly African American. And then the second thing was who does drugs? And he made that African American and people of color. And so out of his campaign came this message over and over and over again. Who is it that does wrong that makes you suffer? In particular, African American, but in general, people of color. So then you get to, was it June of this year where we had the LA uprising? You get to that, and you see a people that have been treated systematically, and by people I mean all kinds of people, not just the African American community, who have had justice and liberation and participation systematically withheld from their communities, systematically withheld. And you see them rise up over a symbolic act of injustice. It wasn't that that was the worst thing that had ever happened. It became the symbolic act that said, this stands for what has happened up until this moment. And they rose up. They rose up in protest. They rose up in affirmation of self, and they rose up in affirmation of rights. And what did George Bush say just like that? What's going on in LA is not about protest. It's not about civil rights. It's about people committing crime. And he laid it right in the lap of morality, so that you were to watch the television and think, who are the bad people in this country? Who are the people you don't want in your neighborhood? People of color. And so people can be moved on that kind of emotional argument, and it's very clever, and it works for people. And I think that we're going to see worse from that. It leads us to major discrimination against a people. For the lesbian and gay community, the same kind of thing is done, and for the feminist community. That for the lesbian and gay community, the central piece that is put forth, and this is what was put forth in Oregon with the No Special Rights video, which was produced by the Oregon Citizens Alliance and sent out to 10,000 churches. The centerpiece of that video is the notion that lesbians and gay men sexually abuse children. And so the sexual abuse of children, which horrifies, I believe, all of us, that if we polled this room, your sexual identity wouldn't have one iota to do with it. You would say, I don't want my child or the child of anyone else sexually abused. That we have known it in our own lives, and we don't want it to happen in anyone else's life. And we would say we would go to the line with that. So if someone comes to you and says, these are the people who sexually abuse children, you would say, I'll sign a petition against them. I'll vote against them. In a second, just in a second. What is left out of that, this is the misinformation and the disinformation. What is left out of that is who is it that sexually abuses children? We know from the women's anti-violence movement, we know from the Department of Justice that 95% of those who sexually abuse children are heterosexual men. Where people get confused is that they think that men who sexually abuse children are gay. And what we know is that still, the vast majority of men who sexually abuse children are heterosexual. They are people in places of trust. They are uncles, they are brothers, they are fathers, they are coaches, they are clergy. those are the people who sexually abuse children. They are the people that the kids trust. So what does that leave us? That leaves us then looking in the wrong place for abusers. That leaves us then putting our kids at risk by saying to them, go out there and watch out for the queer boys because they're going to abuse you, rather than watch out for the person who's in your home. Watch out for the person who's in your school. Watch out for the person who's in your church or synagogue. And believe me, I hate to tell anyone that they have to watch out for people in places of trust. It seems a terrible, terrible thing to have to tell a male child or a female child. But that's the reality that we live with. That's where the abuse is taking place. So when that misinformation goes out, they then have two compelling arguments. On the one hand, no special rights for these people who sexually abuse children, and two, they are criminals, they are sick, they are perverted, they are twisted. And why the gay and lesbian community? Why choose that as one of the emotional issues? I think it's a perfect place to go if you're going to do it. If you're going to do a campaign like this, if your goal is to set precedent so that you can attack all of those laws that are the laws of protection and anti-discrimination and liberation. Why? Because we're like one of the youngest groups around. We've only had visibility since the Stonewall in 1969. What is that? 23 years. It's not very long. We were always there, but we weren't visible. We didn't have a movement. So we've only been in people's sort of view since then. And so people don't know very much about us. They don't have any idea. You know, they only recognize lesbians and gay men by their grossest stereotypes. They don't recognize all of those other people who are just there looking like heterosexuals, acting like heterosexuals, living regular and common lives. And so it's easy then to feed misinformation into that. It's easy to say, you don't know what perverse things these people do. You don't know what sick things these people do. People don't get that. And so they can feed that in. The second reason that it works well is that you can set precedents because we have so few laws, because we have so few policies that are in place. And so here you have in Colorado and you have in Oregon two major precedent-setting legislative initiatives. If these pass, it will be the first time in U.S. history that a constitution has been amended to take away rights rather than give rights. I would ask you to think about that. If you want to set precedents of what we can do to a people, I would ask you to think about that. If we can strike down these laws through changing the Constitution, what can we do next in terms of changing the Constitution? Is that a precedent that you would be willing to live with? I would hope not. I would certainly hope not. I want to talk a second about these two laws. Thanks. These two amendments. Just real briefly, I need to stop this talk. It's sort of running on, isn't it? Here in Colorado, it's to rescind the anti-discrimination laws that are in place. And it's also to prevent any others to be put in place. This one, see, I think they're testing in two different ways. One, they said in Oregon, Lon Mabon, who is the head of the Oregon Citizens Alliance, said this is a national test case, and you will see this used in 1994 all over the country, or many places in the country. So I think they tried two different styles. The one here is a slightly narrower, and the one in Oregon is the wider, to see which one, or if both, they can get away with. The one in Oregon has three parts to it. The first part is like the one here, which is to rescind, and to say that people cannot have minority status, they can't have quotas, they can't have that kind of thing. But the second piece of it, and it gets sort of really more and more comprehensive as it goes along. The second piece of it is to say that the state and local governments can't spend monies to promote homosexuality. So that means that For example, if you have a library that has books in it about gay men and lesbians, then that book has to be taken out, or you can't purchase books for that because they'd be using state and local monies. That if you had an AIDS program that money was being funneled through and they was dealing with, say, with gay men or with lesbians, then they would not be able to receive that money so long as they dealt with gay men or lesbians. If you wanted to have a gay and lesbian pride march, you wouldn't be able to get a permit. You know, it's that kind. So all of the things where you have presence, you know, you would not be able to do that. Counselors in schools would not be able to counsel gay and lesbian students about their sexual identity. All of that. So those monies couldn't be spent to promote. Now, the notion of promotion of homosexuality in this country means if you say the word lesbian and gay in a public place, that is the promotion of homosexuality. Fascinating, isn't it? Fascinating. The third part of this is, you know, this just goes on and on. You're all smiling like, am I making this up? I'm not making this up. This is in writing. This is on the ballot. The third part of this is that the state, local governments, higher education, and public education have to actively teach that homosexuality is abnormal and perverse behavior. And by the time you get to that, you've covered it all. You've taken away the rights. You've taken away the visibility, and then you actively discriminate. You actively say that this is wrong and this should be eliminated. And by the time you get to the end of that, you've basically wiped out a category of people. So if that passes, and that becomes the standard, I think that we are in very, very serious trouble here, not just for the lesbian and gay community. Because what I would say to you today, as I've been trying throughout this, that this is not just about lesbians and gay men. This is about all people who seek participation. This is about all people who seek justice. This is about democracy itself. This is about who gets to have authority over one's life. Who gets to make choices for this person and for one's own community. Who gets to sit at a decision-making table. Who makes the rules and who gets to participate in the rulemaking. That's what this is about. This is the threat that's here. The issue here is not morality. Morality is an issue that can be dealt with in a religious setting. It can be dealt with in a home setting. It can be dealt with in a private setting. This is an issue about human rights. That's what we're looking at here. And we have to be very, very clear on that and keep it framed for what it is. See how they're cheering. They like that part of the speech. So in doing that, I think we have to look at what this feeds into. And I don't like to use this lightly, but I believe it feeds into the whole notion of fascism. I think that we stand in a real danger. A danger of a tightly legislated, controlled people who don't get to have authority over their lives, who get led this way or that way because they don't have adequate information. I think the place that you can see it, and the place that scares me the most, is in the schools. That I think the greatest challenge to fascism, the greatest threat to fascism is critical thinking and the free flow of information, that everyone can have access to true and real information. If we have that, if we have schools that produce that, if we have free public libraries that are well funded, have you noticed what's happening in public libraries in this country? I think we need to make them a bottom line issue, an absolute bottom line issue. But what we see in the schools, and I would ask you to run this test in your own school board, is that we see them so infiltrated by the religious right that they've already been tremendously transformed. And I think critical thinking is not taught in very many places in this country. The way you run the test is this. You look at your school board and you say, is this school board bogged down in major controversy about sex education, about school-based clinics, about the dispensing of condoms, about multiculturalism, about evolution, about teaching creationism, about secular humanism? Is it bogged down in controversy over any of those? If it is, you can count on that the Concerned Women for America and the people who are the foot soldiers of the Lord are either on that school board or having major influence on that school board. I believe that all of those issues are about information for our children that save their lives on the one hand, and on the other hand, give them their lives so that they can participate freely. The country that I want to live in, I don't even know if it has boundaries, but the country I want to live in, everybody has the ability to do critical thinking, even if it's not like my thinking, even if they don't follow my path. I want them to have the information that enables them to make decisions on their own. The withholding of information and the banning of books and the refusal of letting our children work with what the Christian right would call values clarification, that kind of critical thinking, scares me to death. I'll give you one more example of the schools. A few years ago, Health and Human Services out of Bush's administration was very concerned about how many teenage suicides were occurring. And when those, I don't know if you remember that time, it seemed like there was just a number of teenage suicides in the country. And they commissioned a report, that was a governmental report on teenage suicide. And what they found in that report, this was Louis Sullivan, who was an appointee of Bush, which means basically that it is the Bush administration. What they found in that report is that large percentages of the children who were killing themselves were children who were dealing with gay and lesbian issues. Now, some people read that they were killing themselves because they were so horrified that they were gay or lesbian. It wasn't because they were horrified, it was because they were in schools where they were attacked and called faggot on the school ground, where they didn't have a single model to look to as a teacher who was gay or lesbian. They didn't have a counselor that they could go to. They didn't have any support for thinking about, talking about, dealing with their sexual identity, and they were taking their lives. And what did Louis Sullivan and George Bush do? They repressed that report. They said this report cannot be sent to the public because in talking about this, it promotes homosexuality. For me, what that says is that the Bush administration said, I had rather see these children dead than gay. That's what we mean about the withholding of information. When we can't do HIV teaching and training in schools because you have to talk about sex, means that I had rather see them dead than to talk about sex. I think we have to change that. I believe that all of this can be changed. I think it can be changed by people such as ourselves. I think that we have to look at this and think about democracy. We have to think about inclusion. We have to think about participation. We have to think about liberation. They are offering a vision of the past. They're saying, look back to a time in our history of maybe the 40s or the 50s, pre-civil rights. They said, this is the time of order. This is what we offer you as a vision to go back to. A time when men were just coming back from the war, and young white men then could get a GI Bill and go to school, and they could get a job, and they could get a house, and the economy was doing pretty well. And it was a time of order in this country. I would ask you to think at whose expense that order was bought. That was a time when segregation in this country was legal, illegally enforced. That was a time when male authority was unchallenged by women. That was a time when lesbians and gay men did not have visibility and participation. That was the time in the traditional family when the secrets, the horrible secrets of family were kept in that family. Incest, battering, rape, alcoholism. That's the time they ask us to go back to. And it's a vision that a lot of people find appealing because they feel like their neighborhoods have gone to hell. They feel like their jobs are no longer there. They feel like everything has fallen apart. There's drugs, there's crime, there's all this stuff, and they're looking for scapegoats. And they say, let us go back to that time, to those little white houses with the picket fences, when everything was good for us. Good for whom? That's what we have to ask. Our job is to create a new vision. Our job is to create a vision that includes everybody in this thing we call democracy. And I believe that that's a moral vision. I don't know that you get any more moral than that. When we talk about the religious right, I think we need to talk about the religious middle and the religious left as well. And those who are not religious at all, who have a moral vision that says everybody has the right to be whole. Everybody has the right to be complete. Everybody has the right to be able to live his or her life without harming other people. Everybody has the right to support in life. Everybody has the right to work, have jobs, to education, to be able to participate. I think instead of calling for traditional family values, I think we need to call for new human values. And we need to name that morality. We need to say, this is a job that can be done, that we are in charge. This is what the religious right has said. We'll do a grassroots movement made up of ordinary people. That's how change should come. It should come through grassroots movements made up of ordinary people. I don't want change to come from the top. I want it to come from us. But I think that we have to have that vision of change. We have seen that racism and sexism and homophobia unify the right. They can get behind those three things and move forward. Racism, sexism, and homophobia divide us. They prevent that vision of inclusion from happening. And that's what we have to have, I believe. I think we have to have everybody participating, everybody being there, and everybody counted. No matter how different we are, no matter where we come from, and how we appear, we all have to be there at the decision-making table. We all have to be a part, I think, of this whole vision of justice and liberation. Thank you very much. So